Good night to the viewers out there on Facebook Live and other social media platforms. My name is the Member of Parliament for Pointe-a-Pierre, David Lee, and tonight we are discussing the United National Congress on behalf of Pointe-a-Pierre constituency, why we should repeal the procurement amendments that was passed by this government in December 2020. So tonight I have the pleasure, we're having a discussion here tonight, a different format we are using for Pointe-a-Pierre. And tonight I'm joined, I have the pleasure of having some guests with me to discuss the procurement legislation and the reasons behind that we should repeal this piece of legislation. Next to me on my right, I have past Senator Tahaka Obika, young, bright individual who his forte is in economics and finance. He will join us and give his ideas and views on the procurement legislation in respect to the economy, trade, and finance. Joining me, I have the pleasure next to Senator Obika. Next to him is my colleague, my brother, Member of Parliament for Faizabad, also Deputy Political Leader of the United National Congress, Dr. Lakram Brudo. Thank you for joining me tonight, Dr. Budo. He will also be discussing, in respect to the procurement legislation, the medicinal, the health issues and medicine, respect to the vaccines and etc. in respect to procurement. Next to him, next to Dr. Budo, I have a friend, a television host, Mr. Sudat Prasad. Welcome for joining us here tonight, Mr. Prasad. Mr. Prasad is the producer-presenter of a morning show called Unwind on a new TV station, WESN Content Capital. Mr. Prasad hosts his morning show Mondays to Fridays from 8 to 9:30 on all the cable networks, on Flow, etc., all the different cable networks. Mr. Prasad has been, over the last few months, Mr. Prasad has had a host of guests on his program in respect also about his procurement legislation. So he'll bring the views of his guests, people who would have been part of the show, and given their views of repealing and the issues of this procurement legislation brought by this PNM government. You would have had guests like Mr. Mariano Brown, Karen Teixeira, Gary Aboud, and a lot of other individuals who have a grave concern about the procurement legislation. As you know, the procurement legislation, based on how the PNM brought it in December, they butchered it, and we are now, and also, I forgot, sorry, I also forgot to mention that Mr. Sean Sobers, past Senator, young, bright attorney-at-law, will be joining us virtual to give his views from the legal perspective. Also, we were supposed to have had my colleague, MP for Tabakit, Anita Haynes, but due to an emergency, she would not be able to join us here tonight. So I apologize for Sean for kind of forgetting you at the moment, but you're virtual, so I made up on that. So again, I want to thank all my guests, all my colleagues who are here to help me enlighten the population why we should repeal the procurement legislation and giving them an insight how we feel about it. As you know, Pointe-a-Pierre is in the heart of what we call the crown jewel, our Pointe-a-Pierre refinery, our oil refinery. Pointe-a-Pierre, the refinery, sits on very, very valuable real estate. I think when people talk about Invaders Bay as prime real estate, they are prime within Pointe-a-Pierre, especially the seafront area that is part of the whole real estate of Pointe-a-Pierre refinery. It is very, very valuable pieces of real estate, land and bungalows and houses, etc., that based on how this procurement legislation has been brought by this government, they can sell out all these valuable pieces of real estate unknown to the population. And we saying enough is enough, and we need to repeal that piece of legislation to ensure we as taxpayers that there's a transparent and accountable process via proper procurement legislation to avoid our valuable assets being sold out to friends and family unknown to the population. So I also have, before I get into our discussions, there was a video that was shown recently this week by Mr. Gary Aboud. He did a video. I think it is very valuable to add to show to the people viewing here tonight what are his thoughts, and put things in perspective from a Port of Spain individual of what is happening in Port of Spain in respect to this procurement legislation and the kind of assets that can be sold out unknown to the population. So without further ado, I would ask the production team if they can switch to the video of Mr. Gary Aboud.
Hi, my name is Gary Aboud. I'm the Corporate Secretary of Fishermen and Friends of the Sea, Trinidad and Tobago. We were in support of the procurement legislation because the Tenders Act never protected the Treasury. And after 60 years, the country is bankrupt. So the procurement legislation presented a solution to stop the criminality of our parliamentarians, of our governments and our ministers with kickbacks and slidebacks and greasebacks. And so people don't realize that this is the port of Port of Spain. It starts at the lighthouse and it ends at Invaders Bay. We are going to take you and show you. And this is the most expensive real estate in Trinidad and Tobago. And the government have announced that they want to privatize it. So why we are making this video is to let you know that the procurement regulation prevents them from selling it in secret at night to friends and family. Maybe my family. But it's wrong. The Treasury must be protected. The next thing we're going to take you to see is Invaders Bay. This is Movie Town. From the lighthouse to Movie Town is 2 miles, 3 kilometers. And look at what it is. It's perfect land. You could put anything you want, apartments, resorts, anything. It's the most valuable land in Trinidad and Tobago, and we are privatizing it. But we need to protect the Treasury. This is our asset base. Invaders Bay is the most expensive land in Trinidad and Tobago. Last week they advertised it. Who is protecting us if the procurement regulation allows them to sell it in the night, in secret, at any price? There's no transparency, no accountability. The procurement regulation must be reinstated to allow the procurement regulator to do his job. This is another example. Here you see China Railway construction, and they put Caribbean. What is Caribbean? A joint venture. What is joint venture? So that they are giving our land. The Rowley government have amended the Procurement Act to allow what they call government-to-government arrangements to be secret. But it's a very vague term because China Railway Construction is a privately owned Chinese company. But here you see they come and they put a sign that they have a joint venture. And then they're given prime real estate and prime state assets. And there's no oversight. There's nobody, a third party independent, looking on to say that is fair value, that is reasonable. So how can they get this land opposite West Mall to put up a Chinese architecture design building and put up a sign saying that it's joint venture? So why the people of Trinidad and Tobago are not being protected? Why is the secrecy? What is the motive behind Dr. Rowley keeping secrets from the public when he's selling what we own? What we own, it's ours. And they're giving it away like thieves in the night, like they've done for the past 60 years since Dr. Eric Williams. And people are afraid to talk. This is our country. There's nowhere for us to go. We can't go back to India and Africa and China and Syria. There's no place for us there. But what we own, they're giving away without procurement. So what we are asking is that the Rowley government must immediately return to Parliament, because we are not going to stop. If it costs us our lives, we are not going to stop. For 60 years, they've raided the Treasury. They've raided the Treasury and left the country bankrupt. Now we have an opportunity to protect the Treasury. Please, please, Dr. Rowley, please. You cannot defraud an entire nation and allow its defrauding. It's wrong.
So there we have Mr. Gary Aboud, who is not a member of the United National Congress, giving us an insightful video of what is, in his views, what is happening in respect of, in Port of Spain area, in respect of how damning this procurement legislation as is, as amended by this government, can really do damage to our valuable assets in Port of Spain. And this is just part of Port of Spain. I mean, Gary Aboud touched about the port, the privatization of the port, the valuable lands, the real estate of the port. He talked about Invaders Bay, which is another piece of prime real estate. He also mentioned some development that is going on. I actually saw it last Saturday opposite West Mall in the west, another prime area of real estate. And that's just Port of Spain. And we are talking about Point-a-Pier, which sits on another prime pieces of real estate, and also companies within Point-a-Pier. And I would like to ask further, when Dr. Bodo gets into his presentation and his discussion, even looking at the Augustus Long Hospital, which was a very, a private hospital, but it's part of the whole Petrotrin Point-a-Pier refinery for the employees, and now that has been neglected. I think they use it something in respect of COVID, but that is another hospital that I'm hoping that they might be looking to privatize, unknown to the citizens of Trinidad and Tobago, unknown to past employees of Point-a-Pier, Petrotrin, etc. So, when you look and you listen to Gary Aboud, I must thank him for developing his video and bringing out to the forefront, as he always does, issues that impact on the people and the lives and the citizens of Trinidad and Tobago. So again, I would open up the discussion, and I would like to pass on over before I get back into my presentation. But before I get into asking the other my colleagues to give their views, I just want to give a history and overview of the procurement legislation, that the timeline, to put things in perspective. On December 5th, 2014, the People's Partnership, led by the Honorable Kamala Persad-Bissessar, passed the Public Procurement Disposal of Property No. 2 Bill in 2014. So it was under the People's Partnership, led by the Prime Minister at the time, Honorable Kamala Persad-Bissessar, that passed the first Procurement Disposal Property Bill in 2014. What had happened is that in 2015, we were putting together the regulations, and elections came, and the PNM took over in September 2015. And one of the issues for the PNM in their manifesto, they were talking about one of the first things that they would do when if they got into government, was to ensure that the public procurement legislation act and the regulations were passed, and it would put things in place to fast track the public procurement legislation. In June 2016, the PNM brought a bill to amend the regulation, the bill that the PP government did, for the removal of the regulator by a tribunal. So they tweaked the public procurement bill that we passed in 2014, of bringing an amendment for the removal of the regulator by a tribunal. In March 2017, the PNM government, under Prime Minister Rowley, brought another amendment to the legislation, of reducing the term of office for the regulator and other members of the board appointed to govern the office of the procurement regulation. So again, in March 2017, they tweaked the legislation again, without passing the legislation. On January 12, 2018, Mr. Lalchan, the country's first procurement regulator, was appointed, and he was appointed by the former President Anthony Carmona. That was in January 12, 2018. On November 30, 2018, the Minister of Finance receives the regulations from the procurement regulator, Mr. Lalchan, and he said, the Minister of Finance said they were being revised. This is November 30, 2018. In 2019, they had constant delays to proclaim the act by the Minister of Finance, and he was saying that the regulations need to be reviewed and even redrafted. So they were stalling over the last 5 years, between 2015, when they came into power, and up to the general elections of August 20, 2020. So for the last 5 years, the PNM government, led by the Honorable Keith Christopher Rowley, did nothing as far as bringing the procurement regulation into being. They were playing games with the population. And you would remember, if you look back in the last 5 years, what sort of transactions took place. You had a transaction with the Australian government, with the fast ferries and the procurement of vessels, government-to-government relation deals. You would see a lot of different other transactions taking place without the proper procurement regulations in place at the time for the last 5 years. What happened on December 4th, 2020, when the PNM won election, on December 4th, 2020, they brought amendments to the Procurement Act, where it was a host of things that they amended. And I would ask Mr. Sobers, when he gets into his presentation, to enlighten the population of the different issues with these amendments that they came in December 2020. So really and truly, when you look back at the history of this PNM government for the last 5 years, they really, I would say, the UNC would have been saying that they really did not want the procurement regulations in place. They didn't want the bill in place in the form that the UNC, the PP government under Honorable Kamala Prasad Bisesa, bought in 2014. And what we are saying, I think what the country is saying, even Gary Aboud is saying, that we need to, the PNM government need to repeal that piece of legislation they bought in December 2020, and give us back the procurement bill that was passed by the PP government, that gives oversight, transparency, and accountability for the taxpayers of this country. So I now would like to ask my colleague, past Senator Tahaka Obika, bright young economist, finance individual, to give his insight into the procurement regulations.
Thank you, MP Lee. And it's a pleasure being here, and to the people of Trinidad and Tobago, it's important that we understand what exactly this thing is about, because there are so many things that went wrong in this legislation that if I have to spend time on them, we'll be here until tomorrow, and we don't have that time. So I'll just focus on three narrow ones. One is bid rigging and the definition that they use for it. The other is the arrangement regarding the exclusivity of contracts with government-to-government arrangements, borrowing from international agencies, and then, of course, we have the Minister of Finance inserting himself into the process. So you have a minister. I'll start with the last one. You have a Minister of Finance. So picture we have 22 members in the PNM in government, and they have an opportunity to execute a project. The project is $500 million, and they have a choice of going through the hard-nosed, detailed, checking everything, procurement regulator, independent. They can't bully him, they can't threaten him to lose his work. His job is secured based on the way he's appointed or she's appointed. And then you have your partner, Colminbut, the Minister of Finance. I mean, who will you choose? It is clear that it is obvious that the PNM created this loophole in the law so that they can send the ball by the partner all the time. That alone basically lays waste to everything else that was done in the procurement regulation bill, because all that minister has to do is step out of the cabinet room, recuse himself, and if, for example, you have some buildings he wants rented, he will get them rented, as we saw in the case of the Attorney General. So there's nothing preventing a minister that is intent on benefiting more than his or her salary because of this procurement regulation bill. Because of that one thing with the Minister of Finance creating a parallel system where he becomes basically the alpha and the omega in procurement regulation. So for the people of Trinidad and Tobago, let me make it even more simple, because not everybody could understand economic speak or legal speak. If you in your household and you have a decision to make, you're a child in your household, you have a decision to make. You want to go and play football outside with your partners, or you want to go and play video game, and you go by mommy and mommy say, no, you cannot do that unless you do the chores in the house. You have to sweep the living room, you have to make up your bed. Or you go by daddy and daddy say, well, you want to go and play football? Go and play. Which one will your child choose? Obviously they're going by daddy all the time, if daddy is a softer one. So bring that square to this legislation. Because you have to break things down very simple for people. Bring that to this legislation. If you are a minister and you have a decision to make, if you're going by the hard-nosed procurement regulator who will make you cross all your T's and dot your I's, or if you're going by a partner, the Minister of Finance, call me, but it is clear that they are going to go the easy route because they wouldn't have to check and balance anything. So that is the first thing, and I'll pass the ball on because the other points will take me. So I think that is the greatest issue that I have with this legislation.
Thank you, Tahaka, for that insight into that, the financial aspect. I just want to put out on the discussion from the board point of view. You have a board in place in the procurement legislation. You have a board headed by Mr. Lalchan, and one would have to remember that this whole procurement aspect has some issues even among themselves as board members. And after the amendments of the legislation back in December 2020, what you found happening is that, and it was there in the media, on Monday the 4th of January 2021, the deputy chairman of the procurement board, Mr. James Chankit, tendered his resignation as deputy chairman of the board. And that is coming out literally a month after these amendments were passed, tweaking the procurement legislation, really butchering it. And for Mr. Chankit to resign speaks volume of, I would say, in my opinion, that he wasn't in agreement with the amendments of the legislation. That's my view. And there was another board member that resigned, I understand. I am putting it out there, another member by the name of Mr. Otway. He had also tendered his resignation around the same time as Mr. Chankit. But Mr. Chankit got the airplay or the media play because he's his deputy chairman. So there was another board member, Mr. Otway, that also tendered his resignation. I think he had another year as a board member to fulfill. So these are concerns that the public is not aware of, and the public needs to ask questions. Why two senior board members? Because Mr. Otway is a upstanding individual. I think he has a law degree, or he's a lawyer, and to be appointed to be on the board of the procurement regulator isn't something that they would have taken lightly. They would have made a concerted decision to sit on the board because they want to give back to the country, and they understand the importance of being part of the first board members of a procurement legislation regulator board. And for Mr. Chankit and Mr. Otway to resign speaks volume. And then I understand, I'm putting it out there, that there were 3 new members that came onto the board. Someone replaced the youth, as far as the youth position on the board, and one has to ask if these 3 members, and there are 2 members on the board who actually work in the Pointe-a-Pierre refinery area in the Heritage, the new company set up by this government called Heritage, as board members sitting on the procurement regulator board. And one then has to ask, as a member of Parliament Pointe-a-Pierre, if these 2 individuals would be conflicted when as you know, certain aspects of the entire Pointe-a-Pierre refinery and the crown jewel and the real estate is up for sale. So I put that out I put that out in the public, and I would not call their names. I think it is there if one do their research on the board members. It is there for all to see. So I just want to add that to Haka, to what you were talking about. And before I get into my other two guests, I have my colleague, past Senator Sean Sobers, attorney at law, who would piggyback and add his aspect of the legal aspect of the procurement legislation that Tahaka had mentioned. So Sean, good night to you. Thank you for joining us. It's a pleasure always. I know you're doing it virtual. I'm always honored to have your insight from your legal mind. So I turn over to you, Sean.
Yeah, sorry about that. I recognize that my mic, yeah. I know that a lot has already been said in terms of procurement regulations and the bill itself and the inherent bill. And I listened intently to what MP Lee was saying when it came to the history of the procurement legislation. And I think that is extremely important when we are dealing with an administration who loves to come to the public when it is convenient to them and indicate that they have been doing a huge amount of work when it comes to pursuing an aggressive legislative agenda, depending on crime or the economy as it may be. And they like to paint the UNC in unpatriotic colors and in unpatriotic terms, as if we are not ones to support good legislation. And I was extremely happy and contented to hear MP Lee speak about the history of one piece of legislation like this procurement bill in the hands of the People's National Movement and the callous treatment of the bill by the PNM. To further the points made by MP Lee, I would want to place it squarely on the record as well too, that it is a UNC administration who picked up the buck way back in 2010 after having sight of something called the OFF report, right? The OFF report was a commission that was designed to investigate and inquire into the happenings of UDCOT, as it then was. And the current prime minister of the country was someone who had issues regarding the operations of UDCOT and the questions and the irregularities that were occurring at UDCOT at the point in time. And it would have been Dr. Tuari in his contribution on the bill in 2014, who indicated that UDCOT in particular, some of the recommendations coming out of the OFF inquiry, basically he said that, so from these OFF recommendations, we see that there were problems in the last administration of the People's National Movement, not the United National Congress, but the People's National Movement, having to do with corruption issues, having to do with value for money issues, and having to do with local content and local participation and inclusion issues. And it is the United National Congress who furthered the advancement and the concretizing of this particular legislation. And just like Mrs. Prasad Bisesa has done from time immemorial, she makes true to her promises. And in the beginning of the first session of Parliament in 2010-2011, draft legislation of this procurement bill that we have now was sent to a joint select committee. And, we had mass consultation with stakeholders, and the bill was eventually passed, as Dr. MP Lee would have indicated, in 2014. And it was not without delay, it was not without problems, mass problems, because the PNM at every turn of the dial, they caused issues. They did not participate comprehensively within the Joint Select Committee. They abstained when it came to voting, both in the House and in the Senate in 2014. And now, it should not be a surprise when you consider the history of this particular administration in dealing with this particular bill. it should not be a surprise with respect to stripping the legislation down as they have, and leaving it as bare bones and as open for attack not only on the patrimony of Trinidad and Tobago, attack not only on the treasury of Trinidad and Tobago, but attack on our tax-paying dollars. I would want to touch on the aspects of the legislation. I know that Dr. Bodo will speak a little bit about, in particular, Clause 5 of the bill, which amends Section 7(5) of the Act. So Clause 5 of the bill deals with two amendments. One is to Section 7(2) of the Act, which basically removes in its entirety a certain degree of oversight. It removes from the procurement regulator the oversight as it pertains to government arrangements, which MP Lee would have touched on and which Mr. Aboud would have touched on his video. And it also, to address something that Mr. Aboud missed out on, it also removes government to international financial institutions arrangements from the Office of the Procurement Regulator as well too. So apart from government to government matters, government to private international financial institutions have also been stripped from the bill. So you have the situation, we've spoken about the hostile vessels. We must not forget, I think it would have been in 2018 or 2019, that China gazebo fiasco that a lot of persons would have spoken about, which was an embarrassment on the country. When we looked at that contract, which contained some really, really terrible and horrendous clauses that would have benefited this company and would have totally left our nationals and this country in a real precarious position. If left up to this particular administration, arrangements like that will fall outside of the ambit and the remit of the procurement regulator. There will be no oversight, there will be no transparency, and there will be no accountability. Clause 5 also amends Section 7(5), which I know MP Bodo will speak about as well too, wherein the Act now removes, these amendments now remove from the bill the ability for the procurement regulator to have oversight when it pertains to certain services provided to public bodies or state-controlled enterprises, such as legal services, financial services, accounting and auditing services, medical services, which I know MP Bodo will talk about. But this is to also leapfrog off of Tahaka's point. Any or such other services as the minister may, by order, determine. So this list, as egregious as it is in its current format, is not limited. It is wide as the Sagasso see, insofar as any service then the minister may, by order, determine to fall within this category that will not be within the remit, will not be within the ambit of control by the procurement regulator. The minister can just determine, and that will not be allowed to be looked over or to be under the control or the remit of the procurement regulator, which I think is extremely dangerous. And then when you move on to Clause 6, Section 13(1) of the original Act, 13(1)(o) of the original Act is completely deleted. And that deals with the ability of the procurement regulator to have control over the disposition of state and real property assets. And that falls squarely in line with what MP Lee was speaking about with respect to Petrotrin and what Mr. Aboud was speaking about with respect to the port. And this is an extremely dangerous, progressive manner that the PNM has, at least as a citizen of this country, I've come to understand by this particular administration, that they will do all that they can possibly do within their powers to operate in a clandestine manner when it comes to selling off what we own as taxpayers within this country. Let's not forget that. Let's put that squarely on the record for all persons concerned. These are assets. These are goods and services that we own by virtue of us being born here, by virtue of us paying our taxes when they are due. We own these things, and we should have a say through an independent regulated body with how all of these things are procured and with how all these things are being disposed of. right? And we did it right. The People's Partnership did it right in terms of advancing this particular piece of legislation from 2010 to 2014 and having a transparent, accountable body being created, legislation being created and put in place. And all that was required to properly operationalize this legislation was regulations. And there was a total song and dance for a number of years as to why those regulations could not have been enacted, right? And then we see the real reason for this particular act not being enacted today in the form of these heinous amendments. And again, an attack on our patrimony by advancing these amendments, which could only serve to benefit the People's National Movement and not the people of Trinidad and Tobago. I pass it back to you, MP Lee, and I could comment a bit further on some aspects of the legislation as we move forward.
Thank you, Sean. It's always a pleasure getting your legal mind and putting things in perspective, as how you did just now. I want to thank you for your discussions and helping us steer our discussions further along. I just want to remind, based on what Sean would have said, that the amendments that was brought by the PNM government in December 2020 played around with some clauses, and one of the, I just want to repeat, especially for my area of Petrotrin, Pointe-a-Pierre, one of the amendments that they did is completely remove the procurement office from disposing, selling property owned by the state. So they took that out, and the procurement regulator has no oversight of disposing of state assets, like the Petrotrin refinery, the real estate of Petrotrin, the hospital of Petrotrin, and that alone is within the Pointe-a-Pierre constituency. That was clause 6. They also, what they did is completely remove, as Sean would have said, and I just want to highlight, from scrutiny, government to government transactions and the public-private partnerships, so that, you know, once it's the government is a government to government arrangement, again, the procurement regulator has no oversight based on the amendments that this government brought. And one of the critical things is another amendment that Sean would have mentioned, where they removed oversight from legal, financial, auditing, accounting, and medical services. And then the catch-all phrase is by order, whatever they deem to be, and whatever that could be. So that could be anything. So it's a dangerous piece of amendments that this government brought in December 2020, and that is why the United National Congress, and along with other voices in Trinidad and Tobago, is asking this government to repeal these amendments that they brought and bring back the procurement legislation as what it was brought in 2014. So before I turn over to my two other guests here tonight, I want to put things in a little bit of perspective, because I saw over the weekend there was a golf tournament in the Petrotrin compound, because there's a golf course in the Petrotrin compound, and when I look at that, the grounds is pristine, and it would have cost a lot of money to get those grounds, the golf course, in a ready state for a competition that happened over the weekend. And when you look at, I saw a video circulating of the Garakara Park, which we all know the history of Garakara Park. You know what it was used for: cricket, cycling, track and field. A lot of activities happening in Garakara Park. I have my members here. Dr. Bodo would be well aware of Garakara Park. Tahaka Obika grew up in the Marabella area. He's well aware. He would have been taking part in that Garakara Park area. Mr. Sudat Prasad would be well aware of the rich history of sporting events that took place in Garakara Park. It was the home of cricket. A lot of our cricketers came through that grounds. And when you look at that video and you see the dilapidated state of affairs in Garakara Park, and then you look on the weekend, a golf tournament taking part in the Petrotrin refinery, you have to wonder what is really going on in our country. So again, without delay, I want to thank Sean for that insightful legalistic mind that he gave us about the procurement legislation. I would like to pass over to my colleague, my brother, Dr. Aboud, who is a member of Parliament for Faizabad and a deputy political leader of United National Congress. Dr. Aboud.
Thank you very much, MP Lee, and thank you for having me in this former in the Senate. And before I go into the medical issues, and Shaw did mention the amendment to Section 7 of the Act, where they added a new subsection 5 regarding to exclusion of medical services. So I'll come back to that. But David, I just also wanted to mention the issue that we in Faizabad would have with some of the Petrotrin assets, because there are many assets in Faizabad which I'm concerned about. For example, in Forest Reserve, you have the club which has been abandoned, and as you mentioned, Guarakara Park. Recently on a drive through the compounds to get to Point 14, I noticed that compound which was utilized has been in disarray. And of course there are many other assets in the Faizabad Library and Point 14 areas that belong to Petrotrin, and one is left to wonder how these assets are going to be disposed of, both in terms of real estate and facilities. You mentioned the issue of the Augustus Long Hospital, and I just want to put on the record that in 2013, the People's Partnership Government invested substantially in the Augustus Long Hospital in terms of renovations, and of course that is something that needs to be considered. I am aware that there has been some current input by this present government into Augustus Long Hospital for the treatment of COVID patients, and of course when COVID goes away, our concern would be how that asset is going to be treated with, and hopefully not disposed of, and remain part of the health sector. As you know, we have a shortage of beds currently in this country, and I am hoping and trusting that this will not be quietly disposed of to some private partner as indicated. The issue of public-private partnerships is also very important. As you know, the Couva Hospital, which was also meant to be a teaching hospital, there's the issue of public-private partnership in terms of making it a teaching hospital. I don't want to go back into the history of the Couva Hospital. I'm very happy, and I'm sure that the population of Trinidad and Tobago is happy that it is now opened. Never mind it took a pandemic to open the hospital, but it is there and functioning. But again, we have to think post-COVID what is going to happen, and if a public-private partnership is going to be utilized to bring a medical school, then of course that needs some sort of oversight. And as we see, this current legislation excludes public-private partnerships from oversight by the procurement regulator. So it is very, very worrying. But I just wanted to speak a little bit about the amendment to Section 7, which is the addition, and Sean mentioned this, the addition of a new subsection 5, which amongst other things excludes medical services from oversight. And when the issue was debated in the Parliament, those on the other side in the government came up with some, what I consider some very lame excuses trying to justify the exclusion of medical services. And I am not certain what would have been the reason for the exclusion of medical services. But there is a lot involved in terms of procurement of medical services. The annual budget that is passed in the Parliament, there's also the need for something called the external patient program, and these are services that are contracted outside of the normal arrangements, of the normal allocations to the RHAs and so on. So for example, you have services contracted for cardiac services, heart surgery and so on, for renal dialysis, for cancer services. And if these are now going to be outside of the remit of the procurement regulations, then the question needs to be asked how these arrangements are going to be made and who will benefit from these arrangements. So that is something that really is of concern. The other issue, of course, that is very topical at this time is the issue of vaccines. And I just want to put this in perspective, and as you know, it is a matter of great concern to the country in terms of Trinidad and Tobago not being able to procure vaccines for whatever reason, and I understand that attempts are being made to defend the position. So we are in, of course, a very difficult situation. But at the end of the day, we are expected to procure approximately 1.4 million vaccines. If we are saying that we have to vaccinate about 700,000 of the adult population, then we are looking at procuring 1.4 million vaccines. If we look at the allocation from COVAX, which is just over 100,000 promised, not one vaccine delivered as yet, and I'll come back to that, and the procurement through the African Medical Supplies Platform, which will offer another 400,000. So that makes it about 500,000. So it means that there will be a gap of 1 million vaccines approximately that need to be procured. And the question now is, how are these vaccines going to be procured, and what is going to be the oversight process for that? If we are looking at the sums involved, currently what we have bought from the COVAX, we are paying about US, I think, approximately $4.40 per vaccine. So if we are looking at 1 million vaccines remaining, we are looking at a substantial sum. And of course, what is happening worldwide in terms of procurement, in terms of the availability and pricing and so on, I think that the population will need to be aware of the kind of expenditure. And again, this is where we would be at a disadvantage in terms of not being able to look at the procurement issues. So in this procurement bill needs to be repealed. There's a lot that is happening in the medical services sector, and of course there's a lot of the need for oversight. I just want to leave it there, David, for the time, and perhaps I can come back on as required.
Thank you, Dr. Budo. Again, always for a well-balanced, thoughtful contribution. Listening to you, I want to put it squarely that this government and the country, based on what you just said about our vaccines for the COVID, we are in problems. We are in serious problems. And, I would have expected more concern being voiced, especially from some certain fractions in the Port of Spain area, who have been very vocal when things, when they need the opposition support, and the opposition is now calling upon these same bodies, especially in the Port of Spain area, to come out and voice their concerns about the lack of vaccines, and we don't know if we're going to get these vaccines when. I understand the Minister of Health said it's better to be safe than sorry. I don't know what he means by that, given the stage after 1 year, coming on 1 year of a lockdown of an entire country. I also want to put it squarely as a member of Parliament for Pointe-a-Pierre, that when you mention Augustine Long Hospital and the kind of refurbishments that would have gone into that hospital, and it's a state-of-the-art hospital, from what I understand, I am hoping that the legislation is repealed as far as disposing of assets, so that the Augustine Long Hospital stays in the hands of the state, that will benefit the communities for Pointe-a-Pierre, especially where we're located in the Point Lisas Industrial Estate, to complement the other hospitals that surround the Augustus Long Hospital. All right, and the location of Augustus Long is prime property real estate. So I just want to put that on the table in our discussion. Dr. Buda, again, thank you for coming to be my guest. I consider you my brother, a colleague, well respected by me and my other colleagues. As I turn over to my last guest for tonight, Mr. Ciudad Prasad, who will put things from perspective as a TV producer, a host of a morning program that is growing. I have been part of his program on a morning, especially within the procurement regulation bill. He had several guests who were very vociferous against these amendments and how it's, and the approach by this government as far as procurement legislation. So that I want to turn over to Mr. Subrat Prasad to voice his views as far as, how he sees the procurement, these amendments affecting the country. Mr. Subrat Prasad, thank you for joining me here tonight.
Well, thank you, and good evening to everyone. It would appear that the Public Procurement and Disposal of Public Property Act, what has happened to it in terms of the 3 amendments, it seems as though it's 1 step forward to beat bubble and 3 steps backward to facilitate bubble. I mean, that seems to be the message that I've gathered from the various persons who have interviewed on the program. And I'll give you an idea of some of the people. Karen Teixeira, former, she's an attorney at law and a former finance minister. Mariano Brown, former trade minister. David Walker, financial analyst, he's from across in Tobago. Reginald Dumas, also from Tobago, a former head of the public service. Dr. Winsford James, a political analyst. Fazir Khan, he is the president of the Joint Consultative Council. Gary Aboud, corporate secretary of Fishermen and Friends of the Sea. Gavin Nicholas, former attorney general. Gabriel Faria, the chief executive officer of the Trinidad and Tobago Chamber of Commerce. Nerata Wari, the chief executive officer of the American Chamber of Commerce, AmCham. Peter George Jr., he's a businessman, well known. Jai Liladar Singh, he's the president of the Confederation of Chambers of Commerce, and there are many others. These are just a few. They have all expressed strong concerns, most of who were condemnatory of the 2020 amendments, with particular emphasis on the exemptions from oversight of the procurement regulator of the government-to-government contracts, as mentioned by you all, the public-private partnership contracts, procurement of legal, financial, medical services, and so on. And the whole issue of transparency, accountability, and critically value for money, because sometimes if it is that the country could benefit from the disposal of some of the assets, but once the country could benefit in terms of value for money, but there is very little transparency, very little accountability, and we have no idea of whether or not taxpayers are benefiting from value for money. And that is some of the areas of concern from several of the persons who have spoken with. And when you look at the disposal of the CLICO assets, no one can tell, no one from government, the central bank, can tell exactly what is the debt of CLICO to taxpayers, what amount of money the government would have gotten from the various CLICO assets, the performing assets. There are a lot of high performing assets that they would have, they have been in control for the past several years, and no one could state, whether that has even surpassed the indebtedness to the government and by CLICO. Yet you have a lot of the CLICO assets are now being auctioned off, sold off, without the oversight of the Office of Procurement Regulator. And the how to call it, the when you look at the Nikwan in the 400 or 390, close to 400 million US dollar facility was sold for $35 million, where they only paid 10 million US dollars cash, and then preferential shares were given to, so we sold them the company, they gave us back some shares in that company, but basically for a facility that cost 390 million US dollars. As you mentioned the golf course, Dr. Lee, I wouldn't be surprised if in the not too distant future the golf course would also be a subject of some sale or some arrangement to build a hotel facility, something of that nature, very shortly. So those are issues, because it's prime real estate and it's a functional golf course. You said it's in pristine condition, so I really won't be surprised if that might be one of the issues here. But the long and short of it is that we have these various assets that are in the control of the government from CLICO. You have all the other assets of Trinidad and Tobago, the Section 13 that Sean mentioned, where that is now exempt from the oversight of the procurement regulator. I've spoken with the procurement regulator as well, Dr. Munila Lalchan, and if I'm not mistaken, what he has said is that they made a recommendation for the removal of oversight of the procurement regulator from Section 13 because they said they wouldn't want it to be a conflict where they would also have to investigate complaints and so on, or investigate some of these issues, and they are also awarding or disposing of the assets and also in a position. So I think that is one of the areas that he would have touched on. But even on the procurement board, you did mention there are 3 persons who might be even in a position of conflict, and they 2 of the persons, they work at Heritage Petroleum, the other person works at Caribbean Airlines. So those are areas that I think that need to be exposed, and people, the Law Association, others need to weigh in on whether or not these persons are conflicted. Why? Because Heritage is a state-owned company. Caribbean Airlines is state-owned as well, and you have these people sitting on the board where the corporation sole would have jurisdiction over the tenure of these people on the various on these various companies, over the board that via which they might have been hired, over the chief executive officer and these type of things, notwithstanding whatever convoluted process they may be, but nonetheless the corporation sole, he does have that portfolio responsibility, and you have these very same people sitting on the procurement board. So the security of tenure could be threatened, if it is they do not lean in a particular way with respect to matters that may come before the board. So these are very, very serious issues, I believe, and I think it's worth mentioning so that the President of Trinidad and Tobago may also need to review her choice of persons who sit on that board, and especially these 3 individuals. I won't call the name now, but like you said, persons can look at who are the people who currently sit on that board to work at Heritage Petroleum, senior positions. Another person works in the legal department at Caribbean Airlines. So those at this point, I would like to leave it there. Now we are running short on time here, and we can probably have further discussions on these issues.
Thank you, Mr. Prasad. You call out some names that would have been some guests of yours in respect of discussing the procurement legislation. Winfred Jane, Mariano Brown, the parts of the JCC team, Gabriel Farrier, who is the CEO of the Chamber of Commerce of Port of Spain. These are powerful individuals in their own right, and I think Karen Nunez-Teixeira has been a very strong advocate against these amendments of the procurement legislation, and actually calling for a repeal of it and a review of it. So I want to thank you for giving us that insight.
If I may, one very important thing, while all these discussions and all these talks about repeal is taking place, in the meanwhile, the government will continue to do what they do. Why? Because the regulations, even in the amendments, the regulations have reached the Attorney General and the Minister of Finance since the 25th of January, and up to now, there's no regulation on the operationalization of the whole procurement legislation. Once it's not operationalized, then the government can do whatever they want. So all the talk that we are having, all the repeal and everything, the longer that takes place and it just remain in a conundrum, the government will continue to do as it pleases insofar as contracts, insofar as the disposal of public property.
And that's a critical point you just ended up there with, Sudat, is that as long as the regulations are not in play and they take their time, the government goes about their business as they have been going about for the last 5 or 6 years. All right. So I want to just bring in my other colleagues back in play. I mean, I know Tahaka is chomping at the bit, as they say, based on some discussions that would have come up earlier. And so, Tahaka, I turn it over to you.
Thanks, MP. Basically, the first point was the Minister of Finance, and it's good that each speaker spoke on how the Minister of Finance basically has made himself a parallel procurement regulator. former Senator Sobers spoke specifically to the relevant clauses in the bill that allowed for the Minister of Finance to assume this role, and then of course with the exemptions for government-to-government arrangements and international loans, and of course Dr. Bodo spoke squarely on that regarding medical exemptions. The regulator, Mr. Lalchan, basically said that regarding the government-to-government arrangement with China, with the Gazuba contract with the houses in Port of Spain, that if the law were in effect, that would not have happened. That was in 2019. Probably they heard him, and therefore they took out government-to-government arrangements, and they took out international lending in 2020. So this is a direct act by the government to cause mischief. And the Attorney General in May 2020, when speaking about the reason why they exempted international lending, he said, you don't want to go to an international borrower, and based on their arrangements, they're saying, well, our arrangements are such, and it runs afoul of your procurement transparency and accountability regulations in Trinidad and Tobago, so we can't lend you. So what he basically is trying to say is that international lenders would encourage opaque transactions, encourage corruption basically, because our procurement regulations are in line with best practice international standards to protect taxpayers' resources and protect the treasury of our country. So the Attorney General was being disingenuous where that is concerned. So, but getting back to the point, why is this important to the regular person who don't understand economics? The government to go to any unscrupulous international lending body or any other, because you have to remember governments are run by politicians, and if we accept that politicians engage in corruption in other countries, they could go to a corrupt government, engage in a corrupt deal, and engage in a project here in Trinidad and Tobago where the proceeds are split amongst themselves with this corrupt politician in any country in the world under the guise of the exemption of government-to-government contracts. And if people in Trinidad and Tobago, business community, civil society, do any kind of reflection, they would accept the fact that there are many corrupt governments across this planet, and therefore you must never seek to exempt government-to-government deals from procurement scrutiny.
Thank you, Tahaka, for that financial aspect of the legislation. As a member of Parliament for Pointe-a-Pierre, I listened to Sudat talk about the golf course. As a member of Parliament for Pointe-a-Pierre, one of the most valuable pieces of real estate, that land bank of Pointe-a-Pierre, not only within Pointe-a-Pierre, but the Petrotrin had owned land banks in Faisabad, in Labre, Point Fortin, Palaseco area. So when you divvy up and you tally up that real estate asset and its valuable pieces of real estate in prime locations, we have to have a grave concern. I understand the issue you raised, Sudat, about talking to Lalchan, the procurement regulator, as far as disposal of assets, but we still believe that should be maintained within some oversight within the legislation of the 2014 bill, because as the MP for Pointe-a-Pierre, when I look at Gary Aboud's video, and he talked about that waterfront real estate in Port of Spain in the Invaders Bay area, and the high rise and the complex that can go there, millions and millions of dollars that would, if it's given out to friends and family. When you look at the real estate, the seafront property of Pointe-a-Pierre, where the Augustus Long Hospital is based, and also there's a yacht club that Petrotrin used to have, and the bungalows on that seafront area, you're talking prime real estate. And when you go inside the Petrotrin compound and you have the man-made lakes that are there, I mean, we all know Miami style of living, and then you have a golf course. You just picture it. I am sure there are people financiers waiting, chomping at the bit to get into that Point of Peer petroleum refinery area for the land real estate, and they would be seeing a vision for that area, and we have to be careful again that the disposal of state assets are transparent, accountable, and to use Mrs. Teixeira, value for money, so that we as a United National Congress, we as the opposition, is calling on the repeal of this legislation forthwith, and we know that our leader, the opposition leader, the Honorable Kamala Prasad Bisesa, has framed a private bill to bring to Parliament to repealing this legislation, and it will come very shortly towards in Parliament. As you know, I also sit wear a hat of Chief Whip, so that we are doing our groundwork, and it is not about the United National Congress alone. It's about the citizenry of Trinidad and Tobago that is also up in arms and have grave concerns about these amendments that this government brought. So I don't know. As I try to close the program, I know we had planned for an hour. It's a little bit over the hour. I don't know if as a final roundup, before I close, I will ask all my guests, including Sean Sobers, who is on virtual, is standing by. You would have listened to what has happened in this course. So let me start with Sean as the furthest one away. Sean, if you can give your closing remarks. You have to unmute your mic, Sean. We're not hearing you, Sean. You have to unmute your...
It is unmuted. Yeah. So I actually want to leapfrog off of what MP Lee just left off by saying, and I took note of what Mr. Prasad indicated, that the procurement regulators have much of an objection as it pertains to the deletion of section 13(1)(o) as it pertains to the disposal of state assets, because we have another power under section 13(1)(n) within the Parent Act that gives us the ability to investigate on its own initiative or upon complaint from any party involved in public procurement or disposal of public property, or any member of the public, any alleged or suspected breach of this act. The problem with that particular investigatory power is that it comes after the fact. So after the fact that our prime real estate, our prime state-owned asset, our crown jewels in Trinidad and Tobago have been given away, be it incompetently or corruptly away, then after the fact, there's an investigation. Heaven alone would know how long that investigation would take, and then what steps are going to be adopted or implemented to try to do what? To try to claw back the asset? Let's be real. That is not going to happen. And so an oversight of the actual disposal, when it comes up, is the most apt way of treating with the situation. We cannot kid ourselves in Trinidad and Tobago in 2021 to think then that this particular administration is not brazen enough to do things in a particular way, that they're not brazen enough to do things either corruptly, negligently, or incompetently. It has happened before. If you had asked this country, any member of this country, as a matter of fact, the Prime Minister of this country said it for himself, if you were closing your fridge door, you heard it, I am not shutting down Petrotrin. You ask anybody back then if that would have become a reality, they would tell you no. You ask anybody back then if selling the port of Port of Spain, or selling the port in Point Lisas, or selling King's Wharf in San Fernando, or the prime property in San Fernando on the wharf itself, because that is prime property as well, or selling the golf course in Petrotrin, or selling the bungalows in Petrotrin, or selling Flower Pot Beach in Petrotrin, or sandals and the deal in sandals and selling no man's land. All of these things are questions that you would have asked yourself, and you would have told yourself that this could never have happened. But we have seen that they are brazen and bold-faced enough to do it. And we as the opposition, under the astute leadership of Mrs. Kamala Prasad-Bissessar, we are not going to sit back. Civil society has now come on board and they are saying that these things are wrong. We are seeing other people coming out there and doing videos and saying that, you know, these things are wrong and we want a procurement regulation and a bill to be fully emboldened with the powers that the UNC created and gave to it way back in 2014, right? We will continue to fight and continue to illuminate the wrongdoings. But this is a particular situation that requires a robust and aggressive approach, and hence the reason that we are going from constituency to constituency to speak about not only the dangers and the corrupt practices that could in fact occur by virtue of this bill passing into legislation in the manner in which it is constituted now, but the fact that we have seen brazen, corrupt, and incompetent practices by this particular administration in the past. So I am not at all convinced or contented with anybody adopting a position then that investigatory powers after the fact is sufficient, because I can't reasonably see what actions could in fact take place to set right a wrong that will leave a nation naked and in peril. And that is what I have to say on that particular topic. I think it's I think tonight's discussion was extremely insightful. MP Lee, MP Bodo, Tahaka, Mr. Prasad, I commend you for the views that you have shared. And I think and we will see with more rollouts of these discussions, hopefully it can spur other actions for change that could propel this administration to finally do the right thing. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Sean, for your insightful again. I want to thank you for being part of my show here tonight. I think you've brought a very legal and clear and concise discussion, the way you presented your facts. I want to thank you personally as a colleague, as a friend, and I might call on you again and shortly at another point in time for another discussion. So please hold. Let me pass on to Mr. Prasad for his closing remarks.
After the fact, I believe that will be one of the reasons why Robin Otway, an attorney at law, very prominent attorney at law, and James Chamke, the deputy chairman of the procurement board, they resigned in January. Those are very, very pertinent issues that he has raised here. There's also the appeals tribunal, and probably that could be brought into some sharper focus, where some of the issues raised could be dealt with by the appeals tribunal. What I do know in terms of the currently with the procurement regulator, they have already completed their handbook and guidelines, a manual and so on. They have the pre-qualification of contractors. That's an ongoing. Contractors and suppliers, there's a live database of that. Anyone going on the website now can see those, and persons can continue to try to get their contractors and so on listed. There is the building of files in terms of information in the public domain, issues with respect to disposal of public property as it is now, and other issues with respect to certain type of contracts. There's a whistleblowing facility as well too. So those are things that are currently, the bottom line to it is that the procurement office or procurement regulator is not operationalized. The bill is not, the act is not fully proclaimed. The regulations continue to languish at the office of the Attorney General at the moment, and basically that is where we are with the whole this whole thing. So it continues to be a free fall for the government. And there's one thing, as I mentioned, financial issues. NCB Global, that is a name that keeps popping up in terms of some of the financial arrangements that government would have entered into contractual arrangements with. And when you talk about government to government contracts as well too, very often there are very few contracts, to my recall, where there are actual government to government contracts. The boats that were bought from Australia is not government to government. It is the government of Trinidad and Tobago or a state agency signing with Austal, a contract with either Austal or with the other the Incat, the other manufacturer. So it isn't to say the government of Trinidad and Tobago signing a contract with the government of Australia, and I think that is where there's a lot of confusion over very often. So while there may be talks between government officials, but the whole thing is obfuscated basically when you have a contract between with taxpayers' money being spent where between a state agency and a private entity.
Thank you, Ciudad. Again, you know, this government is very crafty in how they do things, and so we agree that it's not a government arrangement with Austal, the manufacturers. But again, because of no procurement legislation or regulations in place, again, you don't know if you're getting value for money. It lacks transparency, lacks accountability, and literally the country has to take the word of Dr. Rowley and his team that procures these vessels on behalf of the citizenry of Trinidad and Tobago, and hope that they did a good job. And well, you know, the issue, the whole Houston negotiation, that was a terrible thing, but that's another story another time. So that so again, I want to thank you for being here, Ciudad, for taking the time to join me as a member of Parliament for Point-of-Pierre to help me roll out you know, our repeal of this legislation. I know the procurement office has staff, but they just, you know, they need the authorization of it. Again, the government is dilly-daddling on the whole authorization of that office. And before I end with Dr. Aboud, I just want to ask Tahaka if he has any closing remarks.
Mic check. I want to thank you, Dr. Lee and Billy, for having me on the program, and of course our viewers. I see we had a good numbers on the live on Facebook, so I'm sure persons are receiving this on their devices in their homes, and there is much to talk about procurement. Even when they say devices, there's procurement for devices for our children's education. But again, of course, we'll have much more opportunities to take bites at this cherry. The simple thing you want people to remember is we've moved from the Central Tenders Board, which is supposed to have been improved with a regulator, with checks and balances, to now a situation where the Minister of Finance, a politician, is in charge of procurement in this country. That is a recipe for unbridled corruption.
Thank you, Taka. Again, I want to thank you for joining me tonight to give me your insight on the population. I now leave my colleague, my brother, my final guest here tonight, Dr. Lakram Budo.
Thank you, Dr. Lee, and I want to commend you on this forum. I want to commend my colleagues and their points of view. I think they've explained very well to the population the issues involved. I think it's very important that the population understand we're in a difficult situation prior to COVID, the economy, and now with the COVID coming on stream, the economy has suffered even more. And the point I'm making is that it is extremely important that whatever taxpayers' dollars are spent, we get good value for money. There must be accountability and transparency. I want to commend those groups outside of the UNC who have taken it upon themselves. Gary Aboud's video is quite interesting, and there are others as well, you know, who are seeing that this legislation is not good for country. So this is part of, as the opposition, it is our role, our obligation, our responsibility, our sworn duty to ensure that that good legislation is passed in the Parliament, and of course to ensure that we always seek the interests of all citizens, and to ensure that we get value for money. So I want to support the call of the Leader of the Opposition for the repeal of this legislation. We'll be going forward to all the constituencies to make this call, and we encourage and urge citizens, you know, to look closely at what has happened with the passage of this legislation, and to support us and to support the Leader of the Opposition, Kamla Prasad Bisesa, in terms of when that legislation, that private bill, is brought to the Parliament, MP Lee. So with those words, I want to thank you again for the opportunity. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Bodo. Again, a pleasure always being with you. Before I close, I want to say, as a Deputy Political Leader of the United National Congress, along with my colleague, who is another Deputy Political Leader, Dr. Bodo, here tonight, that the PNM government, this PNM government, was never committed to proper procurement legislation. They were never committed. Their track record has shown it from 2015 when they took office to now. They were never committed in passing proper procurement legislation. And what we will going forward is that, as I mentioned earlier, and Dr. Bodo mentioned it, Sean Sobers mentioned it, that we'll be rolling out throughout the constituencies of our MPs, literally all 41, Tobago included, educating the people about this draconian pieces of amendments that this government would have brought throughout in the last 5 to 6 years. And what we have also started is a repeal, a petition that all our MPs and all our caretakers throughout the country will be asking all citizens, not all citizens of Trinidad and Tobago. You would have heard from Sean Sobers, civil societies on board in changing the legislation that was brought in December by this government. You would have heard voices from Mr. Prasad program. None of them are UNC. All independent voices, strong voices out there against asking for proper procurement legislation. The leader of the opposition, the Honorable Kamala Prasad Bisesa, is piloting a private bill to repeal this legislation in Parliament, and she's not doing it alone. She's doing it because voices of the population of the country has been calling on the opposition through Mrs. Prasad Bisesa to repeal this draconian piece of legislation for the good of the country, for the good of our citizenry. And also, as a member of Parliament for Pointe-a-Pierre, I am calling on Mrs. Prasad Bisesa, because when I look in my constituency of the valuable pieces of real estate, state assets that can be lost and be unaccounted for by this government, it is scary. And all the constituents of Pointe-a-Pierre should also be scared to the fact that when you look at the Petrotrin area that we all reside in, that it could no longer be there, and it could be no longer part of the taxpayers and what we own. So again, I'm asking all our citizenry, this is not about UNC or it is about the normal man on the street signing on to the petition to repeal this legislation, because it would affect each and every one of us, our grandchildren, our children, our heritage, if we do not do the right thing and repealing this piece of legislation, or forcing the government to repeal these amendments that they were brought in December 2020. So again, I want to thank all my colleagues, my friends, Mr. Prasad, the viewers out there for tuning in tonight. I want to thank Atlantic Communication, who has made our live broadcast here possible. I thank you, Mr. Archie, and his team. I want to thank the party organizer, MP for Couva North, Ravi Ratiram, for really driving this process forward, along with the Honorable Kamala Prasad Bisesa. Stay tuned. This is Pointe-a-Pierre's night tonight. We roll out this throughout the country by our other MPs, and I hope, I put out a plug there that these guests that are here tonight could be utilized in other constituencies. So again, thank you, you viewers. Thank you to my colleagues on NATEX. Thank you to my other MPs who would have been viewing, and thank you to the viewing public out there. And I'm asking you, do the right thing and help us, the opposition, to repeal this legislation of the procurement amendments in 2020. Thank you so much, and good night.